Not surprisingly, The Guardian bought hook, line and sinker the narrative of hysteria surrounding the Australian Human Rights Commission report into sexual harassment and sexual assault on Australian university campuses. Lenore Taylor is one of those fright bats, selectively choosing statistics and deliberately omitting others and relying on appeals to emotion by citing anecdotes from the submissions process to make her case. Quote, "This week we saw the long-awaited results of the Australian Human Rights Commission's Change the Course survey into sexual assault and sexual harassment at Australian universities. It found 6.9% of students had been sexually assaulted in 2015-16, 1.6% of them at university or while travelling to and from. 1 in 10 female students had been sexually assaulted in that same period, 2.3% of them in a university setting. The report included excerpts from responses, story upon heartbreaking story of rape and assault after drunken parties, example after example of grotesque behaviour in university colleges and residences." And then she goes on to give an example. Now, I'm glad she used the word story, because story or report is exactly what they are. You see, people like Taylor want us to imbibe the listen and believe narrative. But until these claims are tested in a court of law, they are just stories and one side of a story. They are reports. Even the Human Rights Commission makes this point. Quote, "It should be noted that the survey results reflect students' individual experiences of sexual assault and sexual harassment. These experiences may not necessarily constitute a criminal offence or a breach of discrimination legislation, which can only be determined by a court. The survey results indicate the prevalence of behaviours which could meet the legal definitions of sexual assault and sexual harassment." And to be clear, I'm not saying everyone that made a report is lying. I'm not saying they shouldn't be believed. I'm saying accusations of sexual assault need to be tested in a court of law. Of course, someone that comes forward with an accusation of sexual assault deserves to be listened to and taken seriously by the authorities. But investigators have to suspend judgment until they have all the facts of the case, including the other side of the story, if one can be ascertained. It's not about believing or disbelieving. As Bettina Arndt wrote in The Australian, the problem is they are not rape victims. They are accusers whose stories have never been tested in court, mainly date rape cases. He said, she said stories revolving around sexual consent. Such cases often don't result in convictions because juries won't punish young men for these very serious crimes unless there is clear evidence of their guilt. That's what led to the trumped-up campaign. Feminists want these men convicted and are browbeating universities to sidestep the criminal justice system to ensure more men are punished. And that's what it's all about. Activists are upset at low conviction rates. How often do you hear statistics that only a tiny percentage of rapes end in convictions? But looking at conviction rates and concluding that therefore rape isn't taken seriously is misguided at best. It's like noting that women only make up 25% of IT workers and concluding it's because of gender inequality. You have to ask why there are less women in tech, and we've seen where that gets you. You need to ask why would it be that low conviction rates for rape happen? And when you ask that question, you get some sensible answers. Helen Rees, formerly of the London School of Economics and who passed away last year, argued in an article in the Oxford Journal of Legal Studies that rape reformers have failed in their efforts to significantly increase the number of rape convictions because they place too much blame on the role of popular prejudices against rape victims. She also argues that the broad consensus regarding the low conviction rate as a terrible blot on the legal landscape is unjustified when rates are compared with those of other serious crimes. Ms. Rees says, in essence, the argument is that reform has proved relatively ineffective because a range of agents, from judges through to the general public, hold rape myths or rape-supportive attitudes, meaning that the number of rape convictions will not substantially increase until these agents are either educated out of their unhelpful attitudes or removed from the criminal justice process. The nub of this argument has achieved broad consensus, as a result of which the approach has achieved some success in shaping public policy. She explains that the claim that rape myths can be challenged on 3 grounds. 1, some attitudes are not myths, they are based on opinion and facts. 2, not all myths are about rape, they are based on how people negotiate sex. 3, there is little evidence that the rape myths are widespread. The proportion of recorded rapes that result in a conviction currently stands at about 7%. However, when compared to conviction rates of other serious crimes, this is not such a shock, she argues. Although this statistic is often cited as proof that there is a particularly stark justice gap in relation to rape, a couple of points should be noted. First, the figure rises to about 12% when convictions for other sexual offences are included, and convictions for lesser offences generally play a well-established role in the criminal justice system. Secondly, deciding whether or not the attrition rate for rape is out of line with that of other crimes depends on the comparator. For example, the rate of burglary is similar, also standing at about 7% in 2011-12. In another article in 2013, Rees notes that in the UK in 2011-2012, of the cases that resulted in a full Crown Court trial, 51% resulted in a conviction. That, Rees said, is also not out of line with other serious offences. Rees suggests the truth about rape conviction rates are far simpler than invoking rape myths. Unlike assault, which often takes place in public and sometimes within sight of CCTV cameras, rape is an offence for which there are usually no independent witnesses. There are a lot of rape cases where there's no other evidence than one person's word against another. Both sides are saying they had sexual intercourse, but don't agree it took place in the same way. I don't think there's much more we can do to increase the conviction rate. I'd like to see a more straightforward debate about the issue. I don't think most people are subject to rape myths. I'm not saying that no one is influenced by them, but the vast majority of jurors, police, prosecutors and judges have decent attitudes. Rape myths are used as a convenient label to explain away low conviction rates. Rape is a very serious crime, but I don't think it's right to focus on low conviction rates as a problem particular to rape. And this obsession with low conviction rates has led to the misguided policies in the United States to lower the burden of proof on university campuses that have resulted in a wave of lawsuits against universities for failing to offer basic legal protections for the accused. The universities have lost approximately 60% of those cases to date, with another 170 cases working their way through the system. And so here in Australia, we should be wary of efforts to up conviction rates by trampling on due process rights. And it starts with the narrative that all those that make reports are victims or survivors. But it gets worse than mere narratives, because there are laws being proposed in Australia that require adherence to the listen and believe narrative. Here's Ken Aronson speaking at the recent ICMI conference on the Gold Coast about one such proposed law in the state of Victoria.
And the most outrageous recommendation I want to mention, and there's more I could mention, listen to this one. In any sexual assault case, the organizations and Larkham recommended that a complainant be allowed to give a victim impact statement to the jury before the accused is allowed to adduce any evidence of sexual history or any medical reports that would bear on the credibility or the case in general relative to the complainant. Now, even in jurisdictions, and not all of them allow it, which do allow victim impact statements, it's never allowed until the jury has come back with a verdict of guilty, and I think that makes good sense. And so this is another instance where what the feminists are trying to do is subvert the presumption of innocence and indulge the presumption that the woman must be telling the truth. And if she's not telling the truth, how can we call it a victim impact statement at that stage of the process before the case has gone to the jury? And of course, the jury could very well come back with a verdict of not guilty. What an anomaly to have a verdict of not guilty in a case where you have someone making a victim impact statement. That's to make a mockery out of the presumption of innocence, in my view.
Then, of course, there is the issue of false reporting. Interestingly, the Australian Human Rights Commission survey dismisses the idea that false claims are significant. In some submissions, students voiced a belief that a large number of reports of sexual assault at university were false. Quote, "I don't think there's much sexual assault at universities. It seems people are so quick to label something and get their name out there and jump to a very serious accusation. It is absolutely ridiculous how quickly people jump to rape claims. I would like universities to be guided by actual crime statistics and not by anecdotal evidence from a television program or from militant Marxist social science academics. I believe that sexual assault and harassment are much less prevalent now than in previous generations, but feminists and other political activists are creating rape culture to scare people into taking them seriously." Then the report concludes, While there are no definitive statistics on the prevalence of false reporting in the case of sexual assault, research has suggested that it is relatively low and in line with false reports for other crimes. Oh really? That's interesting because the FBI says false rape accusations are about 4 times more prevalent than the average of other falsely reported crimes. The survey provides a footnote to a single study carried out in Victoria, which indeed does state that of over 800 rape reports made to police, 2.1% were deemed false. But as usual, the devil is in the details. In 17 cases, 2.1%, the case outcome was clearly categorised as a false report and the alleged victim was either charged or told that she would be charged unless she dropped the complaint. While this represents only a fraction of the sample, the findings will show a much larger proportion of cases where police were confident or reasonably confident that the allegations were false, but there was no attempt to institute charges against the alleged victim. So the 2.1% is an official designation, but they suspect a much larger number that were also false. In the same report, 15% of rape allegations are categorised as withdrawn. Now, of course, feminists argue that complaints are withdrawn precisely because of the existence of an environment of disbelief. The police disagree. The truth is we don't know what the real false reporting rate is, but for the Australian Human Rights Commission to suggest that it's not significantly higher than other falsely reported crimes by relying on one study that on closer examination does not support their conclusion is playing loose with the truth at best. So whilst the Australian Human Rights Commission does not recommend kangaroo courts on campus with lowered standards of evidence, as was done in the US, the narrative that everyone that makes a report should be treated as a victim or survivor is alive and well. And as we've seen, there is proposed legislation that seeks to push this narrative into the courtroom. As I've stated before, if genuine victims of sexual assault can be encouraged to come forward by providing better resources for reporting, then I'm all in favour of those measures. But ultimately, those reports must be investigated by the police and, if deemed fit, tried in a court of law before we can assume that those bringing the allegations are in fact victims. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, or even consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. I'll see you next time.